this episode of Newt's World, fortunately for all of us, the Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. One might expect leaders in the West to learn from an unprecedented victory, including the utter defeat and dissolution of a powerful adversary, the Soviet Union, in the absence of a major war. Instead, our leaders were filled with a combination of arrogance and ideology. They influenced decision-making within elite circles of governance, leading to disastrous national security failures. These security and military failures left us wondering where to turn for many decades. Fortunately, we now have a clear path for our future on the world stage. Former CIA analyst Fred Fleitz's new book, An America First Approach to U.S. National Security, draws on insights from leading national security experts and explores numerous topics ranging from proxy war strategy in the Middle East and Europe to an ambitious and rising China. Fred, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Good to be here, Newt.
I will say, your book could not have come out at a better time. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Iranian-backed Hamas pogrom in Israel, China's covetous eye on Taiwan, and of course, the Iranian security threats currently facing the Biden administration. So I think your book is both timely and necessary. It is timely, as the presidential election is only a few months away, but it is also necessary so that the American people can truly understand the stakes of this upcoming election. Now, like any great military leader, you must have a grand strategy, an end goal or foundation for your decisions. Your approach to foreign policy cannot be reactionary. And as you perfectly state in your introduction, quote, this book will not just serve as a guidebook for a new U.S. administration in 2025, but will help lay a foundation for American foreign policy for many years to come. So if you don't mind, I thought we ought to dive right in with Chapter 1, Defining the America First Approach to U.S. National Security. Could you talk about the main purpose or goal of the America First approach?
I would say that a main purpose of this book is to try to explain to the American people why the world has become so much more dangerous and unstable since Donald Trump left office. And we think it's not just Joe Biden's foreign policy incompetence, but because he abandoned a very successful strategy for national security, the America First approach to U.S. national security. So we define it this way. It first requires a competent and decisive U.S. commander-in-chief, a president who will use military force prudently, but when necessary, to defend our national interests, and will use military force, but keep us out of unnecessary wars, new conflicts that don't involve our strategic interests. It involves a powerful and strong U.S. military that is not tied down with social engineering and DEI. And it means working with our allies and working in alliances and working with the United Nations, but recognizing that members of these alliances, they have to carry their own weight. And we had to pressure them to take responsibility for solving security problems in their regions. We think this type of decisive leadership that puts the interests of the American people first in decision-making, this type of decisive presidential foreign policy decision-making, this is what we have to return to. It's why President Trump was so successful in his foreign policy record and why we've seen the deterioration of foreign policy since he left office.
One of the points you make is that we have to address this growing threat posed by communist China, which for a long time people ignored or actually helped. But I think increasingly, starting with President Trump, there's been an understanding that this may well be the biggest single foreign policy national security threat we face. From your perspective, how should we be thinking about communist China?
Communist China, the Communist Chinese Party, is an existential threat to U.S. national security. And I think every chapter in our book, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's energy security, China is mentioned again and again. And we have a great chapter on China by Steve Yates and Adam Savitt, who work on the America First Policy Institute's China Initiative. on how to deal with the threat from China. This means decoupling from the Chinese economy, standing up to aggression by China, but it also means engagement. It also means a transactional diplomacy where we put up an uncompromising and unflinching policies to resist their exploitation of trade, their growing military, but we also need dialogue to dial back the tensions. President Biden hasn't talked to Vladimir Putin since February 2022. Even in the depths of the Cold War, we had communication and dialogue between the U.S. president and heads of our adversaries. We have to have tough diplomacy, but we also have to have engagement as part of a transactional approach to lower tensions.
In a sense, it's a complex picture. On the one hand, you talk about an America First policy, but it's actually an America First policy that recognizes that there's a global world and that we have a role to play in maintaining and strengthening freedom across that globe. I mean, I think that's part of what confuses people is they hear America First and they think of the late 1930s and the America First movement, which was isolationist, and they don't realize that, in fact, you're talking about a much different kind of engagement that starts with America but recognizes that we are part of the world. Can you expand a little bit on the complexity of the way Trump has woven together both a focus on America and a determination to create a more peaceful and a more secure world?
I'd be happy to. And my friend Morgan Ortegas has a great chapter on NATO and alliances and isolationism. And the first thing that my colleague at AFPI, Keith Kellogg, often deal with when we talk to hostile journalists is to explain how the America First approach in national security is not isolationism. I think this is fairly self-evident when you look at the robust foreign policy of President Trump that had diplomatic engagements, successful ones, around the world in the Middle East, with Russia, with North Korea, with China, on border security, on international trade. People who claim this are frankly lazy journalists who say, well, there was another America First movement that has the same name. That doesn't mean that they're the same movements. And I think the principles we lay out in this book make it clear that this is far from isolationism. This is active engagement that does put the interests of the American people first, but it is not America alone. It is not an effort to cut the United States off from the rest of the world. And I don't know whether we'll succeed in convincing the editorial board of the New York Times or the Washington Post of this, but we're taking our best shot.
President Trump worked very hard to actually strengthen NATO, which involved a level of tough talk that I think shocked and scared the sort of more liberal globalists. But in fact, my sense was that he was clearly totally committed to strengthening NATO, and that when Putin invaded Ukraine, that became a very important building block for NATO to be engaged both in defending itself and in helping Ukrainians. I mean, talk a little bit about the dance that the president went through in getting NATO to begin to finally meet their treaty obligations.
Well, I was at the first NATO summit with President Trump, and I remember how angry NATO members were when the president stood up to them on their refusal to pay the 2% of their GDP towards military spending, which they're required to do under the NATO treaty. Trump took a tough position on something that numerous other presidents had called for, but weren't serious about it. But for President Trump, this is a matter of principle. These other nations gave their word in a treaty, and he has a responsibility to the American taxpayer that other nations carry their weight and not fall on the burden of the American taxpayer while these other nations are spending money on socialist programs and who knows what. It's a matter of fairness. It's a matter of the president being responsible to the American taxpayer. And the result of this tough talk by Trump, by NATO members, is that there was a significant increase in revenue for NATO because they started meeting their commitments. Not all of them, and not all of them met all their commitments, but it was a significant improvement.
And it seems to me that it did enable NATO to have a greater sense of robustness against Russia and Putin. And now, of course, with the addition of Finland and Sweden, NATO's front has been dramatically broadened in that sense. Trump occasionally suggested Putin would never have invaded Ukraine if he'd been president. How much do you think the difference between the weakness of the Biden team and the strength that President Trump took to international relations, how big a difference do you think that's been in terms of our adversaries shifting from being very cautious to being very risk-taking?
Well, let's consider that Putin invaded neighboring states during 3 or 4 successive presidencies, but not President Trump. And he invaded all of them during Bush, during Obama, during Biden, during times of presidential weakness. Look, I like George W. Bush, but you and I know that at the end of the Bush administration, they were beaten. They were beaten by the aftermath of the Iraq War, and this was an opportunity that Putin took advantage of. But he didn't invade during the Trump administration because he knew of Trump's strength. And I've spoken to a former aide to Putin who told me that one reason Putin didn't invade neighboring states is because he thought Trump was simply too unpredictable. He didn't know how Trump would respond. I think it also was a matter of American strength. There was American deterrence under Trump, and there was the understanding by our adversaries that they could not be sure how he would respond militarily if they tried something that threatened our interests.
Whereas I think you can be pretty sure that Biden will not respond under almost any circumstance. It's amazing to watch. There was also a big difference in terms of proxies. It seems to me that it was very extraordinary that President Trump imposed such pressure on the Taliban that for the last, I think, 23 months of his administration, not a single American was killed in Afghanistan. And that was just an amazing achievement. And it was a pretty personal achievement, I think, on his part to communicate how seriously he would respond if the Taliban continued killing Americans. And you compare that with what Biden has been doing with the Iranians, it's an astonishing difference. But talk a little bit about the whole notion of proxies and the way in which Iran and others try to use proxies to wear us down, and why we have to be very clear and very specific in going after them.
Well, I think a strong president promotes global security, not just American security. But under Biden, we've had a president whose foreign policy priority is climate change and has tried from day one to appease Iran, to revive Barack Obama's deeply flawed nuclear deal, which Trump fortunately withdrew from. And the Iranians have watched this weakness. They've watched concessions offered to them for 2 years that were more and more dangerous for our national security. They were so bad, you probably know this, Newt, the 2 members of Biden's negotiating team actually resigned because Rob Malley, the head of the negotiating team, was offering stuff to Iran that was just so really outrageously dangerous for our national security. And I think this led to the Hamas attack on Israel because we did not have a strong president. We had this pointless feuding between the Biden administration and the Netanyahu government. Remember the Netanyahu government complaining about the Israeli Supreme Court and efforts to reform it? What business did we have meddling in an issue like this? But the consequences of us feuding with one of our most important allies, showing weakness on the world stage, trying to appease Iran, I think our enemies saw this as a global opportunity to cash in on a period of extraordinary American weakness. And I fear that means the rest of 2024 will be very, very dangerous.
I have to say that when I watch, for example, the speech the other day that Biden gave in Detroit, where they had to release 10 corrections from the White House, and you realize this is the commander-in-chief. I wonder how much our enemies are taking our measure and deciding that they can be pretty risk-taking. But when you think about the principles, how would an America First system approach thinking about the world and approach thinking about American security and American economic growth?
Well, Robert Lighthizer has a brilliant chapter on how we have to have decoupling from China. We have to recognize that they are exploiting the international trade system, which is basically a form of mercantilism on steroids, and recognizing that we're making concessions to our enemies for trade reasons. It's giving them not just advantages, unfair advantages in trade, but it's giving them defense advantages. It's giving them opportunities to ramp up their militaries, to get military secrets and trade secrets, and we're getting nothing in return. So Lighthizer takes a very hard-nosed approach. He's a buddy of yours, so this probably doesn't surprise you on how fair trade has to be part of an America First approach. And we have to put our interests and the interests of the American people at the very forefront before we sign a trade agreement or engage in anything concerning international trade.
That was one of the great breakthroughs with Trump, and was a place, frankly, where, along with a lot of other people, I was just wrong in thinking that if we were open with China, that China would mature, develop into a more open society, when in fact the Chinese Communist Party understood that maintaining their survival was the key, and they only wanted an open market for the purpose of paying for the dictatorship. They had zero interest in becoming a more open society. But when you look at all this, staying with China for a minute, what's your assessment of how big a threat China is to Taiwan, and how would a America First approach be different from the Biden approach in making sure that Taiwan remains both free but also safe?
I've been discussing with my friend Gordon Chang on when and if the Chinese Communist Party would begin an invasion of Taiwan. And Gordon doesn't think it's imminent. I think that an invasion like this would take place if Biden wins the election. And I think that Chinese officials are really cheering for Biden to be reelected because they like to make this move when they're ready and when America has the weakest possible American president. I think Trump can stave off that possibility by combining tough sanctions with engagement. I think that Trump should be planning on a major summit with Xi to create opportunities for China to improve relations and to not let the relationship to spin out of control. You may remember the first meeting between Blinken and Sullivan and their Chinese counterparts in Alaska. I think this was in 2021. Blinken and Sullivan began it by lecturing Chinese officials in front of the media, and the Chinese lost face and were humiliated. They proceeded to lecture the United States and to attack Biden. These were supposed to be the adults in the room, the brilliant foreign policy strategists. That's just started a downward spiral of U.S.-China relations that got worse and worse, especially after the Afghanistan debacle. I mean, not only do we have to have tough policies, we have to have competent people leading in foreign policy. It's not just Biden. Sullivan and Blinken are incredibly incompetent, and they're making Biden's errors even worse. That's why Bill Burns was made a cabinet member. That's why Biden is sending Bill Burns whenever there's something sensitive to be negotiated. He can't trust his Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. I don't think Bill Burns is a great choice, but I think he's the best Biden has for foreign policy.
You had mentioned earlier Rob Malley, and I keep getting reports that Malley, for all practical purposes, was an agent of influence committed to the Iranian side. And yet Obama picked him to be the chief negotiator with Iran, a country where Rob Malley was actually more for the Iranian side than the American side. And then I began digging into it and discovered he went to high school with Secretary of State Blinken, and he went to law school with Barack Obama. I mean, you have this sort of little family get-together of people who have consistently followed what I think is a totally disastrous policy with Iran.
You know, I've had this debate in Washington for a long time who have wondered whether the policies of Obama and now Biden on Iran are either incompetence or malevolence. Do they naively think that we can make Iran a partner for peace in the Middle East? I think at a minimum, Obama felt that way. But, you know, there are indications of collaborations that Malley had and others who he followed around with, where they're meeting with the Iranian foreign minister, they're attending meetings led by the Iranian government. And it really leads one to question where their loyalties are and exactly what was Iran getting from these meetings. What were they pressing these U.S. officials who were all involved in negotiating for Obama, and most of them came back to negotiate the Iran deal for Biden. I'm not going to say they're traitors or they're working for Iran. I know there's people who say that, but there are a lot of open questions of what was their relationship with the Iranian government and what business did they have working on negotiating a new nuclear deal with Iran.
Well, in the case of Malley, wasn't he in effect suspended from his job because of security concerns that the FBI developed?
Yes, he lost his job and his clearances were pulled, I think, in the spring of 2022. And we still don't know why. What was it that he did? What were the concerns that led to his clearances being pulled? I mean, he had a pretty senior position, was well regarded in Democratic circles. And look, this was a decision by the Biden administration to do this. This wasn't just something that the FBI did. There had to be a green light from the White House to do this. So maybe we'll find out Trump was reelected exactly what was Malley up to.
But it must have been pretty serious for a guy who was that high up to suddenly be on the outs.
It was deeply embarrassing when he disappeared. And given all this chatter about the Iran Issues Network, this effort by the Iranian government to influence the Obama administration's negotiating a nuclear deal, and that he was involved in it, let's just say it stinks.
One of the things that's hard to get across to people is the dramatic difference between the seriousness and toughness that the Trump administration had and that an America First policy would have, and the kind of naivete and shallowness that seems to be baked into how the left approaches the world. I'll give you two quick examples. We've just learned from Reuters that well over half of all the aid that's going in through the pier that the Americans have built into Gaza, well over half of it is now being stolen either by Hamas or by random Palestinian groups, but that it clearly is not going to meet the goals the United States had. A good bit of it, in fact, my friends who are experts in the region think most of it is actually going to strengthen Hamas and to give them food and medicine and things to begin to win the population back to them, because they're now seen as the people who can take care of your family, even though they're doing it with the American taxpayer. And you have to wonder, who is it who designed a policy that basically guaranteed we would lose total control the second it reached the ground? That just strikes me as being so shallow and so ignorant about how the world works, and was compounded in my mind by Blinken going to Kyiv and deciding that one of his major contributions to diplomacy was to go to a local bar and sing a song about freedom. And I was reminded of Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, dancing with Kim Jong-il when they were trying to negotiate nuclear weapons. He apparently got a dance and the nuclear weapons, and she got nothing. Blinken is sort of the same way. It's almost as though they practice at being shallow.
Yeah, I remember the picture of Madeleine Albright clinking champagne glasses with Kim Jong-il. It was another embarrassment. Look, this floating pier was virtue signaling. It was a PR stunt. What did we think was going to happen to this aid when it got into Gaza? What's happened to all the rest of the aid? Hamas is going to steal it. Now, since American soldiers won't go into Gaza to protect the aid, and I don't want them to go into Gaza, this never made any sense. And I think you're right. This aid is strengthening Hamas. It is just an effort by Biden to pretend that he's doing something. And you and I know from history, there are just too many officials who sign on to bad policy ideas so they can tell the voters they're doing something about a crisis, even if the something they're doing doesn't make any sense.
Part of what I'm impressed with in your new book, An America First Approach to U.S. National Security, is that there's an entire team working with the America First Policy Institute, which is trying to develop a methodical, principled, realistic approach to meshing together our ideals and our capacity to get things in the real world done in a way that's to the advantage of America and the American people. I think this is certainly the most profound effort since the Heritage Foundation worked with Ronald Reagan in 1980. And in some ways, in pure sophistication, this may be the most sophisticated effort by a outside government to really think through what we should be doing. As you work with this entire team that you've assembled and who helped you with an America First approach to U.S. national security, what's your sense of the difference in seriousness and toughness of the people you're working with and the people who are currently in charge of national security and foreign policy in the Biden administration? First,
Newt, thank you. That's very high praise coming from you, and I know you're a hard guy to impress. what we try to do here is we didn't just do this in-house. We asked Congressman Michael Waltz, who has an extraordinary chapter on how we have to fix the U.S. military. We have Chad Wolf, who wrote a great chapter. We have Sam Faddis, who wrote a chapter on intelligence reform. You might say to yourself, well, how is intelligence reform related to an America First foreign policy? Well, that's because a competent foreign policy means that tax dollars are spent wisely and prudently. And an intelligence community that is spying on the American people is not a responsible use of our intelligence community or the billions of dollars we spend on it. So I think this was an effort to look at this from different angles. The authors don't completely agree with each other. They take different approaches to issues such as Israel and China. General Kellogg and I put a lot of time into the chapter on Ukraine. Not everybody likes it, but we tried to find a way out. President Trump sent us some kudos on this chapter. And we wrap it up with a very important chapter on leadership. And we make the point in that chapter, nothing we wrote earlier in the book matters unless we have competent national security leaders to implement the president's policies. And Newt, you and I know that one of the biggest problems with President Trump's foreign policy is that he chose people who did not support what he wanted to do. H.R. McMaster, the former Secretary of State, John Bolton. Bolton's a friend of both of us, but John did not support a lot of the things that the president wanted to do. I'm hoping the president will put a document like this in front of potential senior national security officials and say, this is my policy. Do you support this? Before he offers them a job. And I think if we do that, we can really start from day one and get a lot done.
Well, when Trump won, he had no real time to put this together. And I think a lot of people assumed that because he was brand new to the presidency, that it was their job to educate him rather than their job to try to understand what he was trying to accomplish. And what he was trying to accomplish was such a profound break from the globalist, appeasement-oriented, bureaucratic systems that I think it was a great shock. And I think a lot of the very smart people, as you mentioned Bolton, I would say Mattis certainly fits this. McMaster fits this. These are smart people. But they're smart people who had operated within a world which Trump was, in fact, dismantling. And so they were very conflicted because the signals they'd learned for their entire professional career led them one way, and the person the American people had selected was leading them another way. And I think what these 4 years have done has given him a chance through organizations like the America First Policy Institute. He has a chance now, and it shows up in your book, where you have a collection of really smart people who are trying to think through, if this is where we're going, then how do we do it effectively and intelligently, and how do we make sure that we maximize America's effectiveness in the world? He literally did not have time to do that when he was running in 15 and 16. Now he's had that time, and I think your book is an example, and I hope there will be others like it coming out of the America First Policy Institute that really give us a sense that this isn't just random tactics. This is a principled, serious effort to rethink how we recenter the world away from globalism and away from appeasement and away from being confused about our enemies into a system that has the same robust capabilities that the post-World War II generation had created in order to win the Cold War. So I think, Fred, what you're doing is really important, and I think that this book is a really helpful introduction for people who want some sense of what would a foreign policy be like in a Trump presidency, and what would the principles be like around which you build that, which is why I recommend an America First approach to U.S. national security. And I really want to thank you for taking the time to join us and to share these ideas.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank your lovely wife, Callista. We had some peer reviews by some former U.S. ambassadors, and she wrote a brilliant peer review of our chapter on Homeland Security by Chad Wolf. You know, as I said, we had a disparate group of people writing this, and we also had some very good people doing peer reviews to make sure we got it right. So thank you to you, and thank you, Callista.
Thank you to my guest, Fred Fleitz. You can get a link to buy his new book, An America First Approach to U.S. National Security, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. Shane O'Grady helped produce this episode. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.